China and globalization and how China might have a bigger impact as it becomes possibly, world superpower is a really broad topic. And my book, I set out to kind of use a more journalistic lens to help people kind of get a sense of the on-the-ground realities exploring this topic. So I went to countries like US, Canada, obviously where I'm from. In Europe, I went to Italy, Greece, Turkey, and I also drew from my travels in Australia and my 7 years reporting on the ground in Beijing and Hong Kong and across China. So really using case studies and, people with actually vested interests, whether they're in business or whether they are kind of pulled into these conflicts and discussions because perhaps as a writer or an artist or a student or an international Chinese student, they receive pressures from the Chinese state, even if they're living globally. So I really want to try to inject some nuance into these conversations because the subtitle of my book, A New World Disorder, is not just placing blame on the CCP or Chinese government. It's really looking at what Western societies and countries have done or have not done. Everywhere I went, I was surprised that, leading experts in their fields were really frustrated at what they see as a lack of China knowledge in decision-making roles in their countries among policymakers. And that's one of the key reasons why when we see kind of geopolitical conflicts with China, often the messages are quite muddled. Or say, there were so many examples during the Trump administration, so many just falsehoods that were, said by senior leaders, including the president about China, calling COVID the Kung flu. The president saying that basically he thought all Chinese international students were spies. And I think that kind of, pernicious, kind of loose grappling with the facts on China, it really doesn't serve many goals that people say they want to achieve. It kind of leads to the state of kind of disorder and misunderstandings, and it kind of stokes further nationalism.
We could spend days talking about this. I am taking for granted that the theme relates to many different issues, but at the core of them are economics and finance, or certainly that's how I'm going to answer them. So I'll say three things to start. First of all, fortunately, whilst economics is a social science, there are certain factual things that at the end of the day are what most citizens of the world regard as most important. And there are two things about that I want to point out because they get frequently lost in the current very dissatisfactory discourse about China and the rest of the world, or particularly the West. The first one is that the biggest driver of global trade is relative rates of domestic demand growth. Way more important than trade deals. And in that regard, to cite one example, contrary to the emotion about the world of deglobalization, surprise, surprise, in 2021, global trade recovered quite dramatically because of the strength of global domestic demand, particularly in the United States and especially early on China. So Chinese exports were very, very strong last year. I think Korea, country I've followed forever as the first country to report its trade, showed its fastest export growth in 40 years. So there's the first point. Second one, which is actually an accounting identity, and this is crucial for the private sector relationship, is countries that don't save very much but need a lot of capital for investment import it from elsewhere, and those that save a lot but don't need as much for the domestic investment export it elsewhere. That is actually an accounting identity in order to make the balance of payments zero, and it relates partly to trade flows as well. And a lot of those two simple facts frequently get lost in aspects of the debate of China and globalization. And until China's savings rate changes dramatically to becoming lower, if it ever does, or the United States becomes dramatically higher, certain economic patterns that affect global flows of capital and trade will remain broadly similar, irrelevant of what is the mood of particular political forces actually in China or obviously in the West. And it's very important, in my opinion, that people do not forget those things. And in that context, over the 20 years of the BRIC acronym that has existed, somewhere between 50 to 80% of global domestic demand over the whole of those 20 years has come from the US and China. And the rest of us sort of live off the scraps.
From my perspective, there is not any single doubt the inflection point is Donald Trump, of course. It's not a question of Donald Trump to trade war with China. That's actually not the real issue there. It is the issue that Donald Trump opened Pandora's box for what internal crisis that the United States is facing now. And there seem to be, well, you can say genie is out of the bottle. Can Americans push that back? My answer is probably no. Even in this town, even the mainstream media began to talk about 1860. You know, we talk about civil war. What kind of civil war? They used to say cultural civil war. Now they say maybe some real, even physical, might take place. Now, what does it mean? Since we're talking about China and the globalization as the theme here, how that crisis in United States affecting China's attitude towards globalization. My own view is this: I don't believe that actually will discourage China from continued globalization process. I don't want to get into politics, but I basically say political elite are completely committed. And probably their stakes, even including the personal stakes, are now closely linked to what Chinese experience the past 30, 40 years of this globalization process. It is my view that the Western observers completely misread what's happening with some digital companies in China, or the recent pullback, you know, kind of breaking the financial tigers, as Chinese say. That has a lot to do with internal politics rather than with the economic activities per se. Yeah. Jack Ma certainly, well, he deserved it, but that's another issue.